Hello, welcome, good afternoon, and thanks for logging into today's session. James Scullen here from the Australia-China Business Council. On today's ACBC National Briefing, we are discussing Australia-China trade relations, and I'm sure you're aware there is certainly no shortage of things to discuss. In a year that started with severe bushfires and followed by an unprecedented global pandemic, we now see the Australia-China relationship at one of its lowest ever points. As both countries get back to work following their respective economic paralyses, it had been hoped the comprehensive strategic partnership that Australia and China enjoy, buttressed by a free trade agreement, would see our nation's economic engagement play a major role in mutual recovery as it had post-GFC 2008. Instead, we're seeing a very public fallout from COVID-19, particularly since the Morrison government unilaterally called for an inquiry into the outbreak of the coronavirus. Since then, we have seen a very public and undiplomatic exchange from both governments and the imposition of trade barriers on major Australian China-bound industries, namely barley, beef, and now tourism. Australia itself has further tightened foreign investment guidelines, but in a sign of the complexity and strength of the economic relationship, despite the political bickering, Australia's trade with China continues to grow. To delve deeper into the state of Australia-China bilateral relations, we're today joined by Darren Lim from the Australian National University, who will evaluate the merits of so-called economic coercion. We're also joined by Mike Smith from the Australian Financial Review in Shanghai to gauge how the reaction to the fallout is being felt on the ground in China. We have a full house for today's session and want to include as many of your questions as possible. So feel free to text in a question at any time in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please make those questions as concise as possible, as I'll be reading them verbatim to our panelists. We're also recording our session today, so if there's anything you miss, we'll be sending a recording of today's session to all attendees, which will be uploaded on our brand new ACBC website. Our first speaker today, Darren Lim, is a senior lecturer in the School of Politics and International Relations at the Australian National University. Darren researches and teaches in the field of international relations at the intersection of international political economy and international security. Darren's major research interests focus on geoeconomics, or what used to be thought of as economic statecraft, grand strategy in the context of power transitions and international order, and the Indo-Pacific region. Darren also co-hosts the podcast Australia in the World with Alan Gingell. Today, Darren will be helping us to see the recent trade measures through a broader comparative international lens. Darren, thanks a lot for joining us, and over to you. Oh, Darren, I'll just unmute you for us. Just let me unmute you there. Sorry,
okay,
Darren.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there you go. Go ahead,
Great.
Darren, thanks.
Thanks, James. Thanks for that introduction and for the opportunity to chat to everybody. As you've said, I am an academic, so my goal here today is to begin with providing a bit of a conceptual overview about how I view some of these events through the lens of geoeconomics, and then to talk about a different case study that I know quite well, which was the experience of South Korea and the economic tumult that it experienced over a missile defense dispute with China back in 2017. And then I'll finish with some thoughts of what I find interesting about Australia's current situation, but appreciating both that Mike, who is following me, and many of the people in the participating will probably know much more about that case than me. So if we could turn to the first substantive slide, James, I'm assuming you're on top of that. There we go. Well, we can move on to the next one now. And so the first point I want to make is simply to draw a distinction between geopolitical risk and what is now being thought of as geoeconomic risk. In the olden days, in the good old times, we used to think about geopolitical risk as the collateral damage to economic and commercial relations that would occur as a result of politics, right? A coup, a war, expropriation by governments. These were things that companies had to plan for, had to try to think about and plan for. In today's world, though, and we have this notion of geoeconomic risk, where rather than being collateral damage, commerce and international economic relations are now one of the major vehicles, major mechanisms through which governments seek to exercise power, seek to influence other countries and their behaviour, and also a mechanism through which governments perceive their own individual vulnerability, it also, their own risk, their own insecurity. And so this is something that is influencing how governments think about international economic relations, both using them in an offensive case in order to project power, but also thinking about them defensively and how that creates a risk for their societies, for their countries. It's summarized quite neatly in the United States National Security Statement from 2017, this idea that economic security is now national security. And I'm sure everyone who's participating knows of the increasing blurring between economics and national security. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the rise of geoeconomics. Like, why has this state of affairs come about? First, I'll give you a quick definition, one of the most common ones from Blackwell and Harris, 2016, who define geoeconomics as the use of economic instruments to promote and defend national interests and to produce beneficial geopolitical results. So this is the connection here between economics and politics. But also they add the effects of another nation's economic actions on a country's geopolitical goals. So governments can take economic actions for economic reasons, but that can have geopolitical implications for other countries. So that is also included. Why are we living in a geoeconomic world order? Well, of course, as you all know, US-China rivalry is the first major reason, and the clash of systems between a sort of liberal democratic United States and a more illiberal and sino-capitalistic, a different version of capitalism in China. Second, we have the expanding concept of national security, where governments are thinking about non-traditional security threats like international economic relationships through a security lens and looking to use security mindsets to solve those problems. Third, we have a simple increase in the power and the reach of governments. And this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. We are seeing governments take on a whole lot more responsibility, increasing their budgets, increasing the types of things that they do. And that is coming at the expense of markets, of other actors like civil society groups, companies and so forth. So the state is getting stronger, and this is also wrapped up with competition with China, where of course the state plays a heavy role both in the economy and in politics. And the final factor is the weakening of the post-war international order, right? Partly due to a change in the balance of power with the rise of China and other developing countries, but also an erosion of the political legitimacy of the rules-based order in the West. And this is the populist backlash that has given us America First, that has given us Brexit, and that is quite prevalent around the Western world. So all of these factors are contributing to this rise of a geoeconomic world order. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. That's the table setting, and now we'll get to the case study. And this is a case that I have spent some time researching and writing about. And this is the experience of South Korea in 2016, 2017. So in the middle of 2016, the South Koreans announced that the deployment of a missile defense system jointly with the United States. That was designed, of course, to protect against missiles being lobbed at them from North Korea. But Beijing was very unhappy about this because they perceived the building of a missile defense system as being a negative security outcome from them. They thought it might threaten their own national security. And that then began about a 15, 16-month period in which South Korean businesses and industries of many different types experienced disruptions, experienced problems with their commercial relations with China. A disruption to ordinary operations, which caused very significant losses in some cases, minor losses in others. Now, interestingly, the Chinese government denied that there was any formal economic retaliation. They denied as a government that they were doing anything to punish South Korea, but of course relied upon the idea that this was the autonomous and independent patriotic actions of Chinese businesses, Chinese people. But I did some field work. I went to South Korea and spoke to the South Korean government, and they obviously believed that they were being targeted specifically, that these disruptions were often about the THAAD missile defense system. And, the evidence is really irrefutable that politics and economics are really mixed in here. We can go to the next slide to get to the examples. Now, there were many industries that were affected, sorry if I can change the slide myself. But I'm going to sort of try to categorize them into three buckets. The first bucket just has one company in it, which is Lotte Group, which is a large conglomerate, a multinational. And it was singled out because Lotte had owned or controlled a golf course in South Korea that was handed over to the South Korean government so that they could physically deploy missile defense batteries on that land. And so they were sort of, singled out for that action. And that conglomerate experienced a range of disruptions to its operations. The most famous one was the closure of supermarkets, sort of like 7-Elevens that operated in, Lotte Marts that operated in the mainland, ostensibly for violations of fire safety and other health and safety codes. And you saw about 70 or 80% of them closed down in very short order once the deployment had occurred in March of 2017. But it wasn't just supermarkets. There were a whole other range of Lotte operations that included tax investigations, the delayed licensing approval. This included a theme park. In one case, there were property seizures. And you saw losses of around 1.8 billion for Lotte in that year. And they indeed had to exit the China market in the supermarket space because it just became untenable for them to operate. So Lotte was singled out as a company and experienced a wide range of disruptions. It obviously does many things with China, and many of those were affected. The second category is tourism, quite topical now, where the South Koreans experienced a 48% drop in arrivals of PRC tourists in 2017. Now, there was good reporting on this, in particular by the Financial Times, who reported that in March of 2017, there was a meeting in which the government tourism authority, China Tourism Authority, had issued informal instructions to travel agents to stop selling group package tours, group travel tours to Chinese tourists. And that was a segment of the market that dried up almost immediately, while free independent travelers, the ones who could book holidays by themselves, were able to continue to travel to Korea if they wanted to. The third category, and this is a more of a speculative story, but in my research, because we can't prove it, we can only join the dots and identify circumstantial evidence. But this is something that I will say from the outset was a specific concern of the South Korean government and raised by them in their bilateral démarches with China. And that is electric vehicle batteries. There was a huge subsidy program, as many of you may know, that the Chinese government had started to subsidize the production of these batteries for electric vehicles. And it was a very generous one because batteries constitute about 40% of the price of a vehicle. And it was quite a large program. And there were two South Korean companies that had deliberately constructed factories on the mainland in order to take advantage of that subsidy. And they had to wait for 12 months to start receiving the subsidy. But when that clock ticked over from the 12 months, they were denied subsidies from the Chinese government. And this had happened after the THAAD crisis had begun. And so there was a belief on the South Korean side that these subsidies were being denied to them in part because of the THAAD tensions, but also possibly in part because there was an industrial policy motive. The Chinese government were looking to achieve two things at once. One, make a political point around the missile defense system, but two, perhaps favor their own companies who were obviously scaling up their own battery production at the expense of the foreign competition, even though the subsidy program was intended for anyone who was manufacturing on the mainland. Okay, so if we move to the next slide, please. The lessons that we draw away, that I have drawn in my research from the South Korean case study. Firstly, that vulnerability is not uniform. I mean, South Korea sends roughly the same percentage of its exports to China that Australia does, and exports actually increased in 2017 despite these political tensions. And that, of course, is because they're dominated by semiconductors and other intermediate inputs that are not easily substitutable even in the event of political crisis. So the question you need to ask yourself is, how substitutable, how easy is it to forego or replace the lost commerce with the target country? Another good example is Lotte Chemical. One of, you would think that would have been affected by this given it was Lotte, but it actually saw a slight increase in its trade operations with China in that year. Chemicals, of course, being an intermediate input. The second point is that China's own legal regulatory frameworks shaped the political interventions. And the best example here was group travel. It was easy to give an informal order to Chinese travel agents to stop selling group travel packages. Our hypothesis is that it would have been too disruptive to do more to disrupt independent travelers by cancelling commercial flights or by instituting exit visas or something like that. That was seen as being too much. And so the regulatory framework shaped the intervention. Third point is that there were customs problems, there were border frictions with inspections and things like that, and these varied in their strength, but the evidence suggested that they weren't coordinated, that you might have had individual customs officials who were, took matters into their own hands, but weren't acting upon orders, from the central government. And the final point is that, it's useful to look for ulterior motives, whether that's industrial policy, whether that's some other notion of economic security, when you're trying to understand the nature of which industries are going to be targeted. All right, final slides. I've got about 2 minutes to go, I believe. So here are some things that I find interesting about the current situation that Australia finds itself in. The first is the idea, this gets to the ulterior motives, the idea of food security. Obviously, food security has been a really important interest for the Chinese government. And there has been talk, and I'm relying very much on work by Scott Waldron at the University of Queensland, who's an agricultural economist and does a lot of work on China here, about the context of barley in China, and that the Australia was dominating barley exports, and that some parallels had been drawn in China commentary with US soybeans, which have also been an area where China felt vulnerable by relying so much on one supplier. And so while we have a story, of course, about retaliation for steel tariffs, we have a political story about the current tensions, there also may be a story here about the desire on the Chinese side to diversify its sources of barley. And an example that has been used as a success story is US corn, where the US went from dominating the market 90% of exports down to only 9% in 2018. And that has been seen inside China, in my understanding, as a successful diversification strategy that has enhanced China's food security. The second point is to think about market dynamics. Again, this is not my expertise, but my understanding is that post swine flu, with pork coming back on the market, there has been an excess of beef floating around. Some companies have been unable to fulfill their contracts. And so the cost here of replacing beef that has been held up by the loss of the 4 abattoirs is low. And so that's not necessarily to say that there was planning here, and there was an interesting report in the South China Morning Post suggesting that New Zealand imports had similar problems to Australian imports, but were not singled out for regulatory issues. And so I think there is some evidence that this was about the sending of a political message. Those abattoirs were high-end beef, and that could also make a lot of noise. But I think the interesting thing here is that the cost of replacing beef, and beef is a very complex market inside China, smuggling plays a big role, for example, in the market, that it was low because of the situation created by swine flu. And finally, politics, I don't think there's any doubt that it is playing a role. Chinese state media has said it as much. And so that's sort of to round out that you've got a lot of different factors happening here, both internal market dynamics, specific objectives of the government, plus, of course, the political dispute that are all combining to create problems for Australia. And I will leave it there. James.
Thank you, Darren. Darren, just while I've got you, if I can ask you a quick question. I know that with Australia's case relating to barley and beef, the Trade Minister has spoken of potentially taking a WTO route to resolve some of these disputes. Is that something that South Korea explored through multilateral institutions at all?
Very interesting question. What I can say is that as the events were unfolding, starting in July, August of 2016 and going through to the late 2017, the South Korean government was collecting evidence, almost in a forensic sense, to build a case that they could take to the WTO. And in March or April of 2017, they actually raised this issue in the WTO at one of the side meetings. And there's a link in one of my articles on the ABC website to the minutes of that meeting. But I was told, admittedly by someone who wasn't inside government, this was someone who had done work with government but sat outside, that there was not much desire on the South Korean government to actually institute a formal WTO process because that was seen as escalating the dispute. And that South Korea, being the smaller country, doesn't control the escalation ladder, if we're going to use a security frame to think here, and that this would probably end poorly for them. And that their focus was on resolving the political dispute, which, and I can see a question here about how this happened, which happened in October of 2017 through a political agreement that has been called the Three No's. And it required South Korea not to do three things: not build any more batteries, not have an alliance with Japan and the US together, and something else. And that was artfully drafted such that both Seoul and Beijing were able to claim victory. It was just one of those good examples of good diplomacy and good drafting, where both sides could sort of say they got what they wanted, and that allowed for de-escalation. So that's why, so no formal case was brought. I don't have any hard evidence of why that wasn't the case, but I think it makes sense to me that you're looking to de-escalate. You know you can't win if you take matters further in a broad sense, even if you might win a legal victory, and you just want to move past it. And that's very much been the South Korean attitude. Obviously, they're not happy about this, but they just want to move on as quickly as possible, notwithstanding that they were not willing, of course, to budge on the core security interest, which was a missile defense system to protect them from North Korea.
Right. Thanks for that, Darren. That's such a relative example for the Australian case, not just the fact that it's tourism, but just also for the relative size of South Korea to China as to what Australia is to China. Our second speaker today is Michael Smith from the Australian Financial Review. Based in Shanghai, Michael has more than 25 years experience as a journalist and editor with newspapers and wire agencies in Australia, Hong Kong, and the UK. Specialising in business and politics, Michael's roles have included chief political correspondent in Hong Kong during the lead up to the 97 handover to China, news editor, chief of staff, and senior writer columnist with the Australian Financial Review. Mike has kindly given us his time today to provide an update of how the bilateral challenges are being felt on the ground in China. Mike, over to you, and I'll just ask you to unmute as well.
How's that? Thanks very much, James. Thanks for having me here. Yeah, it's certainly an exciting time to be a journalist in China. I've been here 2.5 years, but a lot's happened in that time. But in terms of Australia's relationship with China, I mean, we really are at an absolute low point. I mean, things were pretty bad back in 2008. I wasn't here then, but I'm told by many Australians who have been here for decades that this is something far different. We're at a far lower point, and it's going to be much more difficult to resolve. I mean, the interesting thing is trade's at a sort of a record high, record level. So economically, we're sort of still doing okay, but politically, we're sort of really in the doghouse at the moment, and sort of finding a way forwards going to be quite difficult. I guess the question to ask, from a business perspective, economically, how much damage is this going to do to Australia economically? How much of this is rhetoric? There's a lot of rhetoric coming from Washington at the moment, and Beijing and Australia. But look, Darren's case study on South Korea is really, really timely, because that's a good comparative point, particularly around tourism. So as you all know, China on Friday issued, quite late on Friday, issued a travel warning for Australia, basically telling its citizens not to go to Australia. Saying there's been a lot of racially motivated attacks. So the timing of this warning was pretty weird, because no one can travel to Australia anyway at the moment unless you're a citizen. Chinese tourists can't go anywhere at the moment. So the timing did look a bit odd. It does look very political. There's no denying that. I mean, I think there have been some racist attacks in Australia, according to Australian media reports, but the timing of this is quite odd. And it sort of brings me back to the South Korea situation. It does remind me of what happened in 2017 when, as Darren said, travel agents received informal instructions not to book group tours to South Korea. And look, I spoke to a lot of Chinese travel agents yesterday who specialize in the Australian market, and not all of them, but some of them pointed directly to the South Korean situation. And look, they say by this travel warning at the moment, sort of an informal warning in a way, but they say this could be preceded at a later date with instructions to travel agents telling them not to book any more trips to Australia. So we don't know if that will or will not happen, but it's a distinct possibility. And these sort of travel warnings in China, or these instructions, they're very opaque, and they're always informal. They're sometimes verbal as well, so that the Chinese government will deny this is happening. But if a travel agent gets a call saying no more trips to Australia, they have to comply because they can lose their license. So this could potentially be very damaging. I mean, I think 60% of Chinese visitors to Australia still come on package tours, although that's decreasing. As far as independent travel goes, I mean, it's, you know, I was speaking to some Chinese friends yesterday, and they tend to be quite relaxed with these travel warnings, and they say, look, it's not going to affect our decision, we'll still come anyway. So it's sort of really hard to get a handle on how damaging this will be at the moment. But look, I think this is a clear sort of warning from China, whether it's a warning to Australia to back off on certain issues, or whether it's trying to send a message to other countries not to go down the same path. And we've obviously had the situation with barley and beef as well. And look, we don't know if there's more to come, but there's a sense on the ground here there could be more economic punishment to come. And I mean, you know, as Darren said, there's sometimes several motivations for doing what they do, and barley's been a bit of a confusing situation, because China's anti-dumping investigation against Australian barley did start 18 months ago. So Morrison hadn't called for a coronavirus inquiry then, of course, and there's speculation that this might have been inspired by Australia's use of anti-dumping investigations against Chinese steel companies in the past, or it could have been because of the Huawei ban several years ago or 18 months ago. So again, that's very opaque. But the sense here, you know, could there be more restrictions placed on Australian imports? We don't really know. But the other real risk, you sort of talk to all the traders here, guys who trade in Australian wine and dairy, and they say one of the risks for Australia is that there won't be an official clampdown, but you'll get sort of local customs officials who are sort of reading the political tea leaves in Beijing, and they'll sort of go, oh, Australia's out of favour at the moment, so you get a shipment, you know, of Australian wine coming in, and they could be a little more vigorous with their inspection processes than they normally are. You know, we've seen that with beef with labelling, so they could choose to single out Australian products that way without any official instructions at all, and therefore that creates another risk. Another risk is Chinese buyers of Australian products are sort of thinking to themselves, well, you know, could our products be held up in customs? Maybe we should look at elsewhere. But the other issue is coal. There was a lot of speculation last year about an unofficial ban on Australian thermal coal, and more recently, since the coronavirus pandemic, there's been speculation that power generators in China have been told not to buy Australian coal. Again, that's very opaque. There's no written instructions. It's very hard to confirm. But at the same time, China does need less foreign thermal coal anyway, so it's probably going to be buying less coal from Australia and other countries at the same time. But again, this is another risk. I think one thing that's emerged is the iron ore. It's very hard to find anyone here who thinks China will stop buying our iron ore, which is obviously our most important export. China's still investing heavily in infrastructure, and it does need that high quality iron ore. So, you know, there's a clear message here from China. I mean, the Chinese ambassador to Australia gave an interview to my colleague, the Australian Financial Review, in April, and he indirectly mentioned tourism, students, beef and wine in this interview as potentially being under threat. And then as the weeks go by, we do see developments here. So it really has to make you wonder. I guess the question is now, the big question is, or how do we fix this? How do we get the relationship back on track? And look, it is very challenging. The Australian government, of course, argues it has had a moral duty to do what it did in terms of pushing for a coronavirus inquiry. I don't think it's going to back down on that. I mean, academics in China have suggested to me, well, you could throw China an olive branch by agreeing to bring back all enrolled Chinese university students back into Australia. I don't think that's going to happen. And And of course, there's a lot of work in the business community. The, Australian businessmen on the ground in China are very concerned. They've sort of called on the government to find some common ground with China. Exactly how that's going to be done is difficult. And of course, the Morrison government's National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, that's still going to be launched. There was some speculation that had sort of fallen apart, but it hasn't. So that's going to have a difficult task on its hand, finding an alternative way for the two countries to communicate. And the problem now is at a sort of a very senior level. I mean, because of coronavirus, you don't have the usual global events such as APEC, so you don't have our political leaders chatting on the sidelines at these events, so that can sometimes be a circuit breaker. It sounds like China's not returning, well, they're certainly not returning Simon Birmingham's calls, so it's very hard to get that dialogue back on track. But I think the best advice for business, people doing business with China at the moment is just be very mindful of the rules and compliance. And as you know, China's got an incredibly complex regulatory environment. And I think in years gone past, there was sort of some grey areas that you could kind of skirt around, and you really can't anymore. I mean, China's really clamping down on this kind of stuff. So particularly around labeling and compliance issues, you just got to follow the letter to the law and do everything right, and don't give the authorities in China an excuse to single you out. And I think that's the advice that Austrade's giving to Australian companies. So I don't see an easy way out of this. It's going to be a very interesting time over the next 6 months. And of course, this is all under the shadow of sort of very tense US-China relations. And I'll just conclude though to say that being on the ground in China, the interesting thing is, on a personal level, there's no pushback against Australians. I mean, I've never had anyone come up to me and say, "Oh, you're Australian, we don't like you," or your government's being nasty to us. And I don't get the sense that people I know are going to stop buying Australian dairy products. But it could be a matter of time before that changes. If it gets enough media traction in China, that sentiment could shift. Thanks very much.
Yes, thanks for that, Mike. And as you mentioned, there's different paths forward that Australia can consider. And I'm just going to launch a poll, which is by no means an exhaustive list. But we have a few options there, and you can choose multiple options there for certain avenues Australia and the Australian government could elect to help mend Australian relations. So have a look at that survey, and we'll check in with that at the conclusion of today's proceedings. Mike, if I can just ask you a question before we go to the audience Q&A. If the Australia-China dialogue at the moment is characterized as undiplomatic, I mean, what can you say about US-China dialogue? Like when you look at President Trump, who's been characteristically verbose and referring to the coronavirus as the Kung flu, and Secretary Pompeo seems to be on Twitter every day with a different conspiracy theory. Is this evidence that Australia could potentially be singled out, that America doesn't really seem to be feeling the brunt of any economic measures through its dialogue with China? Or is that because of the size of the US government or the US China trade deal recently? Or how do you explain the way the US government can be so outspoken and Australia seems to be really feeling the brunt of the Chinese government at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, if you sort of have to do a list of countries that are in trouble with China, I mean, the US is definitely at the top. Australia might be second at the moment, maybe competing with Canada there. But and I guess Australia's problem is we don't have the economic might to sort of throw its weight around in the way that the US does. But then, of course, I mean, the US under Trump at the moment is a whole unique story. I mean, the rhetoric. I mean, people criticize the rhetoric coming out of Beijing, but the rhetoric coming out of Washington towards China is really something else. So Australia is copying it, but I don't think as much as the US is. Australia's real problem is that it is sort of seen by China and by Beijing as sort of being Donald Trump's sheriff in the region, and Chinese state media have accused Australia of being a lackey of the US, and there's sort of this sense, and it's been conveyed to our diplomats in China by Beijing, that Australia's following America's orders, and that's why it's doing what it's doing. But of course, Canberra will tell you, no, that's absolutely not the case. We have a mind of our own. We took a view on coronavirus, and we decided to push ahead with that. And of course, Australia's been more vocal in recent years on issues such as Hong Kong and Xinjiang, and it says it's operating completely independently there. So convincing Beijing it is operating so is a challenge. But the other challenge is, if it manages to do that, well, it doesn't really make Beijing any happier. I think the view in Beijing is that Australia's sort of become this bit of a ringleader, and I guess it started with the Huawei ban, which Beijing's reaction to that was initially quite soft, but I think there was sort of this sense that developed in the months after that, within the Five Eyes Alliance, Australia was sort of a bit of a ringleader and advising other countries, including the US, about their concerns about Chinese technology and Chinese influence. So that seems to have angered Beijing, and I think they're really going to single us out for quite some time. And I mean, things have just shifted so much in a few months. I mean, things weren't great under the Turnbull government, but when Morrison came into power, there seemed to be a bit of a thawing in the relationship, and the rhetoric was pretty moderate from both sides, but it's really shifted since coronavirus.
Well, Mike, just while I've got you, there's a few questions relating to FIRB. We have someone ask, how are the new rules on foreign investment being viewed in China? And another asks, should FIRB be renamed to the China Investment Review Board? How have the recent FIRB rulings been received? Oh, are you there, Mike? Okay, well, I think just while we sort out Mike's connection there, Darren, there's some questions for you here. So coming back to the South Korea and PRC example, would you say that, despite that conflict over trade, have things become normal between South Korea and China now? And how long did it take to recover that relationship then?
Yeah, so the normality sort of was formally put in place in October of 2017, so 16 months after the initial announcement, and about 7 months after the deployment, actual deployment of the batteries. And that, as I said earlier, that was with this political agreement called the Three No's. But there were vestiges of the economic disruption that lasted really even until like late last year, even into 2020. Like group travel packages only resumed province by province. And some disruptions. There were reports, we were tracking this through 2019 of things that hadn't righted themselves fully. Now, I can't explain why, other than inertia in the Chinese system, because there was nothing else sort of on the table between the two countries that was a significant irritant. So I think it's a case of when you ramp things up, it takes time to unwind them fully. And this, of course, has been Japan's experience. In a couple of different situations. I saw there was a question about the WTO, if you wanted me to speak to that. My understanding is that it is possible that we can pursue a WTO process, both because the first instance panels are still functioning, and now there is this separate appellate process, a parallel process that Australia actually helped sort of set up with the EU and China as well. That's sort of sidestepping the WTO because of what Trump has done in delaying judges. The question is it in our interests? Will it be seen as an escalation? I think that it's much more likely that we will do this. There are two major differences between us and South Korea here. One, I think we're just, the South Koreans have got a much more deferential, softly diplomatic style generally. I think it's partly cultural. It's partly that they are so close to China that they, feel, its presence even more keenly than we do, sort of tucked away down the bottom as we are. And so there's just more of a confidence. I mean, you know, you're not going to see South Korean leaders say things about Hong Kong. You're not going to see them saying, you know, all these major things. They're not going to engage with some of the human rights issues nearly as boldly as Australia and other Western countries are. So I think that would translate into a greater willingness to go through the process. And the second reason, of course, is that the rules-based order, and the WTO is central to this, is really important to Australia. Like, it's one of the major ways in which we can have influence. And if we want to take China's barley tariffs at face value, there is a genuine live legal dispute here, about dumping, and we want to strengthen the process by using it rather than by simply trying to. So I don't think it would necessarily, that would inhibit Australia the way that it inhibited South Korea.
Darren, while we wait for Mike to dial back in, we've got another question. You mentioned the prevalence of semiconductor trade between South Korea and China. Perhaps we could look at it in a similar way with natural resources between Australia and China trade. David Chong asks, given the biggest money lever that China could pull on Australia will be resources, how likely will China try and diversify away from Australian resource reliance? And will it be viable? I.e., can another supplier be found with the same top-notch quality resources as Australia does? So how do resources look in terms of diversification?
Look, there's a simple sort of broad story you could tell about any product industry, anything that gets bought and sold, which is sort of what's the basic elasticity of demand if you're looking at it from the Chinese side. Like, how easily can they substitute a given supplier, a given product? If it's something that's purchased at a cash register, South Korean cosmetics, Japanese cars, it's much easier to find an alternative. And so diverting that commerce away from your political adversary, so to speak, is easier. When you're thinking about natural resources, it really goes market by market, right? As Mike said, iron ore really seems to be insulated because of the quality. I've seen that there are problems with Brazil now and coronavirus shutting down, mines and ports in Brazil. And so just the economic logic isn't there to disrupt iron ore trade. Coal is different. As Mike said, demand in coal is for thermal coal. Metallurgic coal is different, but thermal coal is declining. They want to support their own industries. And so there is more of a logic there for at least some disruptions. And then food, the two things I'll say, I'll see if Mike... I'll finish my point. The two things I'll say about food is that, one, there is obviously a drive to diversify food sources as a matter of food security and national security, but equally high quality goods. And this was true during Japan's, huge disruptions in Japan caused by the 2012 East China Sea island dispute, and in South Korea in 2017. The high quality goods that don't have substitutes, trade continues. Chinese consumers are discerning. They want the best. And if they can afford it, they will purchase it. And there are clearly things the government can do to disrupt that trade. But by and large, the things that are the high quality, that have a lower elasticity of demand, have been relatively more protected.
Okay, great. Thank you, Darren. Now, Mike, if you can hear me there, we might just come back to those third questions. Are you there, Mike? You might need to unmute your microphone as well, Mike.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, great.
Can you see me? Sorry, my internet's gone down. I'm on my phone, so I don't. Hopefully, this is working okay.
Well, I don't think anyone on the call will be unfamiliar with dodgy internet connections in China.
No.
Now, Mike, we were asking you that question. Someone asked, should FIRB be renamed the China Investment Review Board? And we'd just like to get a comment from you regarding how the Australian government's recent FIRB rulings have been received in Chinese media over the last few days.
Yeah, Look, there's been surprisingly little coverage of the Global Times, of course, but there hasn't been widespread coverage of the recent changes to the FIRB rules around national security. And look, you speak to sort of M&A lawyers here, and I think part of the reason is that China has similar rules. So it has its own national security rules around investing in sensitive assets in China. So in a way, it's going to be sort of a bit hypocritical if China does sort of openly criticize the most recent changes. But I think there still is a sense here that this is all designed to target China, and there's obviously deals in the past, such as Port of Darwin, that probably wouldn't be allowed to take place under these current new rules. So I think there is a real sense that this is targeting China. I think it's still overshadowed by coronavirus, the call for a coronavirus inquiry. That remains the number one sort of inflection point. So I guess it's another issue that sort of stirs the pot a bit, but there hasn't been that much reaction here so far.
You do hear in Australian media the Prime Minister and the Treasurer say, ad nauseum, that any changes are not discriminatory. Are those types of quotes, do they get through to Chinese media? Do you see, Global Times or any Chinese media quoting the Australian Prime Minister saying that these rulings are not discriminatory, or do any of those seep through at all?
No, never. Not that I've ever seen. So no, Australia's sort of point of view is rarely makes it into the Chinese media. I think that's actually a point of frustration for the Australian government, is that China's ambassadors now are starting to do interviews with foreign media, and we've seen it in Australia, and I think we have the deputy ambassador on Q&A. So they are getting their voices heard, and their quotes aren't censored or altered. So, but in terms of if an Australian minister wants to do an interview with the Chinese media, I think there are less opportunities for that, and certainly you wouldn't see their quotes published in full.
And I think what we see in Australian media when we talk about Chinese media, we often see quotes from the Global Times. I was wondering if you could just give us some context as to how the Global Times as a publication is viewed by local Chinese people, and whether it's diluted through like the broad range of media available in China, and whether we focus too much on the Global Times because it is so extreme.
Yeah, there is an argument that we as foreigners, or we in Australia, do pay a little bit too much attention to the Global Times. And look, as a journalist, I'm guilty of quoting the Global Times. Often that's the only reaction you are getting out of China. And look, they're state-owned media. They're part of the propaganda machine. So I mean, everything they write is sort of unofficially authorized. So you have to give it some credit. But look, they're the most hawkish right-wing publication in China. That they're a tabloid. Compare it to the most extreme tabloid you can think of in maybe Britain, and you've probably got them there. So, in a way, their views are very extreme. I mean, the average person on the street in China, probably doesn't read them, but they still have influence. Their editor's very influential. He's got a huge following on Twitter. So we have to give them some attention, but the views are very extreme. I mean, we really jump up and pay attention if the People's China Daily, or the People's Daily in particular, are publishing commentary on Australia. I mean, that really is the Communist Party mouthpiece. So if there's a piece in the People's Daily really getting stuck into Australia, that really means something. And we haven't seen a lot of that, but we did earlier this year. We saw a piece sort of directly criticising Scott Morrison and his handling even of the bushfires and of coronavirus. So that, in a way, that was a direct attack on an Australian Prime Minister by China, which we haven't really seen, maybe with Turnbull, but we haven't seen that very often.
We have a question from Bill Chin, and I'll ask this to both of you, and I'll ask you first, Mike. How would you prioritise the relationship over trade and investment rules in building a sustainable long-term economic relationship between Australia and China? So I think that's just asking, I mean, how can we strengthen the relationship aspect of bilateral relations?
Oh, I'm not clear with the question. Like, in terms of, do we put business over sort of other societal issues or human rights issues? Or
well, I think what are some ways that, you know, in addition to the economic engagement between Australia and China, how can we help foster stronger ties in the relationship? So I think maybe there's people-to-people ties or government-to-government connections, or
yeah. And I think there is a lot of work on that particular aspect, and this has been going on for years, often behind the scenes, and there are really strong people-to-people links between Australia and China, and as you know, we have, you know, there's over 1 million Chinese people or people of Chinese descent living in Australia.
Okay, all right, we may have lost again. Darren, did you have a comment on that question at all?
Look, I see questions like this sort of not so much in a normative sense, but with my political scientist hat on. And you know, as a political scientist, you know, I think back to debates in the West about sanctions policy with rogue regimes. And there's always this question about, if we put sanctions on, or if we punish a rogue country, we're going to empower, you know, the hardliners inside that country, and we're going to weaken the moderates. We're going to weaken the internationalists. And this was a debate that was had about China for 20 years. And I've actually been thinking over the past few days of the reverse of that logic now for Australia, where China should be having these debates as well, because we have a live debate in Australia about how to engage with China. We have very polar camps, you know, clear views being articulated at opposite ends of the spectrum. Often the debates get very personal. But each time, you know, China does something like the tourism ban over the weekend, which, as we've said, has no impact in the short to medium term because there is no travel. The only consequence of an action like that is to empower or give political ballast to one set of voices and to marginalise a different set of voices inside Australia. And that has political consequences for the government. It makes some things, it reduces the political costs of some sets of policies, and it raises the political costs of other sets of policies. And so for me, you know, I look at this as what, you know, the Australian government will do things to normalise, it will de-escalate, it's taking a very soft approach, but the kinds of bold moves that some are calling for, the political cost benefit calculus just is not there for the government right now. And things that are being done on the Chinese side only serve to entrench that even further and make it more difficult for those voices who are urging a different direction.
Darren, we have a question regarding the recent announcement from the Ministry of Culture regarding tourism to Australia for Chinese nationals. And I wanted to ask you how, so the allegations of racism in Australia are very hard to disprove. Obviously racism is an issue in Australia, but I just wonder if you could make a comment as to what is different about an allegation of racism for speculatively trade measures compared to more technical labeling, dumping issues. Is that something less common in international trade? Or I was just wondering if you could make a comment about the difference of racism as a lever.
It's specific to tourism. The other basis for travel warnings has been genuine threats to safety. The Philippines experienced this actually after some protests at the Chinese embassy some years ago. And so you need the modus operandi of these kinds of informal measures is that there remains at all times plausible deniability. So you need some basis upon which to issue a travel warning, and that is going to be a threat to physical safety of some form. So I sort of think of it as being a different type. And I agree. I mean, there is racism in this country. The evidence suggests that the attacks have increased. So there is a kernel of truth. Maybe it is true that there is a fractionally higher percentage chance that a visitor from China could be exposed to risk. I don't think that the Chinese government has the best, grounds to stand to make these kinds of claims, and no other country obviously has issued these concerns. But part of the sophistication of these kinds of measures is that they often have a kernel of truth in them, which makes them impossible to refute fully.
Mm. Mike, did you have any comment about that, about
Yeah,
the allegations of racism in Australia and maybe how that's being reported in China?
yeah, sure. And apologies for my technical difficulties, but look, I think this is a really kind of sinister and dangerous turn of events. I mean, China has shown this week that it's willing to play the racism card. I mean, it's a huge issue in the US, obviously, at the moment, and it's a very difficult one for our politicians to refute and debate, because obviously there is some racism in Australia. If you start denying there is, then you get shouted down. But what China has done is sort of played the racism card to, highlighted these sort of recent attacks and a warning to its citizens not to come. And it is doing this for sort of political reasons. The Chinese Foreign Ministry last night at their daily press conference, they were asked about this, and the spokesperson, I mean, she went through a list of media reports in Australia about racist attacks and complaints by the Human Rights Commission. So they were really trying to paint a picture here about what they think is going on in Australia. And yeah, I think worse than beef barley, I mean, this could be quite a sort of a difficult issue for the Australian government going forward. I mean, it may die down, but if it gets really built up in the Chinese media, you will have ordinary sort of Chinese people going, oh God, I'm not going to send my kid to university there, or I'm not going to go. So it's sort of hard to see how serious this is going to get.
And Mike, this may be a tricky question, but you said that your friends, would generally have no qualms about traveling to Australia in light of a travel ban. In light of a emerging social credit system in China, could there potentially eventuate where, if you travel to a country that the government recommended you not to go, that could have some consequences for Chinese individuals? Is that a hypothetical question at the moment?
It is, yeah, that's a good question. And I must admit, I've never thought about that. I don't even know. I mean, the social credit system is very opaque as it is currently. So I don't even know if that's possible, or anything's possible in China. But so I hadn't actually given that much thought. But it could affect individual travel if there's enough pressure. And look, there is the nationalism issue, and you saw this, there is a strong sense of nationalism in China, and you saw it last year where like Dolce & Gabbana ran some ads that were considered racist, and everyone in China stopped buying their brand. And there was the American basketball NBA was sort of banned by the national broadcaster here over some comments one of its team managers made in support of Hong Kong. So there is a risk you get that sort of nationalistic backswell, and people will sort of go, oh well, Australia doesn't like us, so we're not going to go there. Anecdotally, when I talk to people around Shanghai and Chinese friends, they don't seem to care so much. They're sort of like, oh, we love Australia. We love, the feedback you always still get is, oh my God, we love Australia. We love the food. We love the beaches. It's very friendly. So that hasn't dissipated yet, but hopefully it's not a matter of time.
Okay, great. Well, we will need to finish up very shortly. I just want to add, we have a comment from an attendee saying, as an Australian-born Chinese, I consider myself fully Australian and have never been subject to any racist comments. This has changed in the last couple of months, just my 2 cents. So yeah, certainly there is, unfortunately, cases of increased racism in Australia, which is something that certainly does need to be addressed. Now, I will just publish the poll, and Mike and Darren, I might get you to have a quick look and make a comment if you could. So it seems with 76%, attendees seem that the government-to-government high-level track should be prioritised. Mike, is it still the case that the ministers aren't getting through to their counterparts in China?
Yeah, that's what I heard. That's the real challenge. I mean, I think Simon Birmingham just said a couple of days ago he can't get through to his Chinese counterpart, and he's been trying, since the barley case for quite a few weeks. So the problem is China is not answering our calls. They don't seem to be particularly interested in talking to us at all at the moment, and that's been a problem for a while. I mean, I think it's well known that Xi Jinping hasn't spoken to Scott Morrison. for a long time, whereas he's been speaking to other world leaders. So it's hard to cut through when no one's returning your calls. You can't really send a minister up here and have a meeting at the moment. So that's going to be a real challenge. I mean, obviously, I think our diplomats are working behind the scenes all the time to try and get some dialogue going, but it just doesn't look like anything's going to happen in the near term.
Darren, can I ask you what role high-level government-to-government exchanges played in the South Korean example?
Well, they were the basis of the agreement. I mean, you don't get a shiny agreement agreed to by the two leaders through a bilateral visit without, that happening. So, look, China is still very much a top-down system, and so you're not going to get the kind of stability you need until you get buy-in from the top. And so, for me, it is the only pathway to a sustained, stability in the relationship.
Okay, great. Well, we'll have to end it there. But Darren, thank you very much for joining us today. If anyone wants to stay in touch with Darren, you can follow him on Twitter, and you can listen to his Australia in the World podcast with Alan Gingell. That is always good to listen to each week. Thank you, Darren, for coming on the webinar today. And also to Mike Smith. Mike, I was saying to you prior to the session today that you're making my workload busy with all the articles you're writing from China. If anyone wants to stay, keep abreast with Mike, you can follow Mike on Twitter, and no doubt you're keeping abreast of his AFR reports, which are coming out almost daily at the moment. So Mike, thanks a lot for coming on the session. And to everyone else, thanks a lot for joining us. This has been an ACBC National Briefing. And just to leave you out, I'll just put up I'll share the screen of our forthcoming events at ACBC, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Thanks, everyone.